It's good to be with you. One of the things that Stephanie would want you to know about me is that I am 20 years older than her. And that is the first time in the almost 15 years that I have known Stephanie that she has not taken advantage of the opportunity to point that out. She usually does so with the word, he's old. He's not older than her or anything, just old. So, I don't know, you're slipping a little bit. Yeah, you're growing as a person, or you're getting old and don't like to point that out. In fall of 2013, I arrived at work and I opened my email and had an email from the HR department, and it informed me that I needed to be at a meeting later that morning. And I knew already what that was about. The institution where I was working at the time was going through what they called program reprioritization, which is a really nice way of saying they were doing layoffs. And so I went to this meeting and I sat across from my boss's boss and a person from HR, and they informed me that the program that I directed and the position that I held would be eliminated by the end of that particular school year. Now, as I received these words and I processed this, I realized that the program that I directed was a 2-year program, and I just recruited a group of new students, and they were expecting a 2-year experience. And so as the week went along, I managed to negotiate and was able to encourage them to continue the program through, and that meant that I would be able to stay for 2 more years, which created this really interesting dilemma. I knew now for almost 2 years that a calamity was coming in my life. I was going to be losing my job. I was the primary provider for our family at the time. We were going to lose our benefits. And I also knew that at my age, and with the other things that were going on in the academy at the time, that my career path was closing. I was probably not going to get a job doing what I had been doing in the past. Have you ever known that a calamity was coming? Now, to some extent, we all live with the knowledge that a calamity is coming at some time in our lifetime. Just what you wanted to come to church today to be reminded of, right? That at some point in our life, something bad is going to happen. Yeah, it might be an unexpected death of a loved one. It might be a diagnosis. It might be a natural disaster that hits. It might be a job loss like I experienced. It might be a wayward child. It might be that you become the victim of a violent crime. We all live with the probability, and probably the possibility at least, that something bad is going to hit us at some time in our lifetime. And that probability is a hard thing to live with when we're reminded of it, like I'm doing today, which I'm really sure you're excited that I'm doing that. But we're in the prophets. And when we hold that, it can raise fear. It can cause us kind of to doubt the goodness of God. And it can eat away at our ability to trust God. How do we trust God when faced with the certainty of a calamity happening at some time in our lifetime? Well, as Pastor Steph mentioned, you are in the midst of this series on learning to live from the prophets, and today I get to introduce you to a prophet that I'm going to name Habakkuk. You can use whatever name and pronunciation you would like. It's been a long time since I took Hebrew, but I think that's probably close at least. Now, Habakkuk lived at a very unique time, a time when God's people, the covenant people of God, the Hebrew people, were not just a people group, but they were also a country, the nation of Israel. And at Habakkuk's time, the covenant people of God were doing a very bad job of keeping their side of the covenant. And so Habakkuk, who was a prophet, but he also was a musician and maybe a temple worship leader, he decides to write a poetic lament to God. He decides to complain to God about the greed and the injustice and the violence and the drunkenness and all the bad things that were going on that the people were doing, but not only the people, the religious leaders, and even the political leaders. So the book of Habakkuk opens with this lament. In verse 2 we read, "How long, O Lord, Must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere. I cry, but you do not come to save. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Why must I watch all this misery? Wherever I look, I see destruction and violence. I'm surrounded by people who love to argue and fight. The law has become paralyzed, and there is no justice in the courts. The wicked far outnumber the righteous, so that justice has become perverted. Ever felt overwhelmed by an injustice, maybe that was done to you, or felt overwhelmed by the proliferation of evil in our world? Well, Habakkuk models what we should do when we feel that. We need to lament. We need to protest to God. We need to complain to God and pray about whether we do it on social media. Well, Habakkuk's heartfelt lament is not only heard by God, but God actually replies to Habakkuk. And what does God say? Well, he says something that probably for Habakkuk was not what he was hoping to hear. Because Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 5 reads this way, Yahweh replied, "Look around at the nations, look and be amazed, for I'm doing something in your own day." This is going to happen in his lifetime. Something you wouldn't believe even if someone told you about it. I'm raising up the Babylonians, a cruel and violent people. They will march across the world and conquer other lands. They are notorious for their cruelty and do whatever they like. Their horses are swifter than cheetahs and fiercer than wolves at dusk. The charioteers charge from far away. Like eagles, they swoop down to devour their prey. Habakkuk, he pours out his lament to God about the evil of God's people, and God's like, I see you, so look around. In your lifetime, I'm going to let the Babylonians rise to power and conquer nations, all nations, including Israel. News of a coming calamity. Habakkuk has to live with this and hold this. So what does Habakkuk decide to do? He decides to try to negotiate with God. Ever tried to negotiate with God when you've heard God say something to you? Here is Habakkuk's negotiation attempt. In verse 12, he says, Yahweh, my God, my Holy One, you are eternal. When negotiating, it's good to open and start with, some praise and kind of butters God up a little bit, right? And then comes his strategy. Surely you do not plan to wipe us out. Oh Lord, our rock, you have sent these Babylonians to correct us and to punish us for our many sins, but not to wipe us out, right? Because you are pure and you can't stand the sight of evil. Will you now wink at their treachery? Should you now become silent while the wicked swallow up people more righteous than they? That would be Israel. It's like, God, I get that you might want to use the Babylonians to kind of discipline us, but they're an eviler nation than we are. And you're not going to use them to overthrow us, right? That would actually harm your reputation, God, of being pure and not being able to look at evil. We have lots of echoing going on. So Habakkuk attempts to negotiate with God, as we often do, right? Does it work? No, because in chapter 2, and I won't read the entire thing to you, Habakkuk receives another message from God, and this time God kind of just ignores his attempt to negotiate and instead informs him that not only is Israel going to fall to Babylon, but Babylon is going to fall also. This is what you might call a lose-lose scenario. A double-barreled shotgun of calamity is coming towards Habakkuk and towards God's people. How do you trust God when you are receiving bad news? How do you trust God when a calamity hits? Well, Habakkuk, he's a prophet, he's a musician. He decides to write a prayer that is going to be sung. And in this prayer, which is going to be sung, he reveals how it is that he came to be able to trust God after lamenting, after negotiating, able to come to the place where he can trust God in the midst of this lose-lose scenario. The prayer opens with what we would call technically a refrain, or musically we would call the chorus. And Habakkuk breaks up this prayer with the words Selah 3 times. The word Selah signals that a new verse is about to begin, and it probably was signaling to them when they would sing it that they're supposed to repeat the chorus, like we do in our songs today. And that prayer opens with the actual chorus. The chorus goes like this: I have heard all about you, Yahweh. I am filled with awe by your amazing works. In this time of our deep need, help us again as you did in years gone by. And in your anger, remember your mercy. So here comes the chorus that's going to be repeated over and over again. But now comes the first verse after that, after the Selah. And in this first verse, God invites Habakkuk, and Habakkuk actually kind of tells how he came to look away from his calamity and instead to look up and see God in the beauty and in the power of creation. Habakkuk does this counterintuitive thing. He looks away from the calamity and instead he looks up to see God in the beauty and in the power of creation. He describes his experience of seeing God in the beauty of creation first. In verse 3 of chapter 3, he says, I see God moving across the deserts from Edom, the Holy One coming from Mount Paran. His brilliant splendor fills the heavens, and the earth is filled with his praise. His coming is as brilliant as the sunrise. He looks up and he sees God. But notice the references to the deserts and to a mountain and to the skies and the land and a sunrise. This may sound counterintuitive, but when faced with a calamity, Habakkuk chooses to look away from the calamity and instead to look up to see God in the beauty of creation. But he doesn't just look up and see God in the beauty of creation, he also sees God in the power of creation, which God is sovereign over. So he begins to describe this in the second half of verse 4. He says, rays of light flash from his hands, where his awesome power is hidden. Pestilence marches before him. Plague follows close behind. When he stops, the earth shakes. When he looks, the nations tremble. He shatters the everlasting mountains and levels the eternal hills. He is the eternal one. Lightning, pestilence, plague, earthquake. We might today add wildfires in the west, or floods in Germany, or hurricanes in the Gulf Coast, or tornadoes that often hit us. These, Habakkuk sees, are reminders of the power that God has. And Habakkuk trusts God, and his strength is actually kind of built up to be able to trust God in the midst of this calamity, because he has looked away and he has looked up. And he has seen God both in the beauty and in the power of creation. At the end of my freshman year of college here in Minnesota, I went back to North Carolina, where I had gone to high school, and I worked that summer on a construction crew. And I worked with my best friend John at the time, and he had access to a cabin. And so one weekend we went to this cabin in South Carolina, which was on a decent-sized lake. And the owners of this cabin also had a decent-sized catamaran sailboat. The day that we arrived, we attempted to take the sailboat out, but there was hardly any wind, and so we ended up kind of like paddling our way back, and it was, we're kind of defeated. We had dinner, but then after dinner, we noticed that there was a breeze picking up, and so we were like, this is our chance. So we got the catamaran out, and we set the sail, and we headed straight east with the west wind. And we were churning along, and we were enjoying our success, because we didn't really have much experience sailing. And we also were enjoying the fact that the sun was beginning to set in the west, and the rays were going across the lake, and they were hitting the eastern shore, and the beauty of the shoreline kind of being lit up. Well, as we got to the eastern side of the lake, we kind of turned around, and when we turned around, we found out why the wind had been picking up. There was a storm rolling in, and the wind was getting more and more fierce, you might even say, and of course now we're going back against the wind, so we're having to tack with these long diagonal, and it's taking a long time, and eventually, of course, the rain hits, and the clouds get dark, and there's lightning off in the distance, and we can hear thunder, and we're just hoping just to make it back. Well, by virtue of the fact that I'm standing here today, we did in fact make it back alive. But we were looking up, and we were seeing God in the beauty, but also in the power of creation. Now, Habakkuk models for us something that might seem counterintuitive. When faced with calamities, he suggests that he was strengthened by looking away and instead looking up to see God in the power and in the beauty of creation. How about you? When tough times come, what is your instinct? I know my instinct is to put my head down and try to make it through. My instinct is to analyze the hard thing that's going on, to figure out why it happened and all those things. But here is Habakkuk, who's faced with certain calamity. It's coming, a double-barreled one. And his trust in God is strengthened because he looks away, but he also looks up, and he sees God. But it's not just looking away and looking up that strengthened Habakkuk to be able to trust God in the midst of this tough time. His ability to trust God is strengthened by not just looking away and looking up, but also by looking back. The next part of this song, after the next Selah, which signals the singing of the chorus, and the next verse that is coming, Habakkuk writes these words. You brandished your bow and your quiver of arrows. You split open the earth with flowing rivers. The mountains watched and trembled. Onward swept the raging waters. The mighty deep cried out, lifting its hands in submission. He's still caught up with the power of creation and these events that are happening. The sun and the moon stood still in the sky as your brilliant arrow flew and your glittering spear flashed. You marched across the land in anger and trampled the nations in your fury. What's he talking about? He ends by saying, you went out to rescue your chosen people, to save your anointed ones. Habakkuk is looking away, and then he's looked up, but now he's looking back. He's looking back at the times when God had used nature to assist in the rescue, the salvation of God's people. There were plagues that convinced Pharaoh to free God's people from slavery. There was wind that parted the waters so they could pass through the sea of reeds on dry land. There was something that stopped the water so that the Jordan River stopped at flood stage and they could enter the promised land. There was the sun and the moon standing still so they could defeat the enemy in the promised land. And Habakkuk is finding the strength to trust God by looking back at God's acts of salvation. For us as followers of Jesus, we too are strengthened to trust God by remembering God's act of salvation through Jesus' life and his death and his resurrection. Well, how do we trust God when tough times come? How do we trust God when a calamity hits? I'd like to suggest to you that Habakkuk offers us a model. after lamenting and negotiating, he looks up to see God. But he also looks back to see God's acts of salvation that God did for us. And in this prayer, he models also two other things that he does. He doesn't just look away in order to look up and to look back, but he looks away in order to also look around. After the next Selah, after the singing of the chorus again, Habakkuk looks around to see when justice has come to the wicked. Remember, he began his book with this lament because of the wickedness of people that seemed to be going unchecked. And so after this next Selah, he writes these words: "You crushed the heads of the wicked and stripped their bones from head to toe." This gets kind of graphic. "With his own weapons, you destroyed the chief of those who rushed out like a whirlwind, thinking Israel would be easy prey. You trampled the sea with your horses and the mighty waters piled high." Habakkuk is remembering when God crushed the wicked, when times of salvation also brought judgment against people who were evil and wicked. And Habakkuk is strengthened to trust God in the midst of this calamity because he's looking around and seeing times when the wicked got what they actually deserved for their actions. Times when justice flowed down like a mighty river. Now, I confess, I struggle to spot these times today. I struggle to see the glimmering flecks of justice floating on the sea of injustice that is this world. The rich seem to be getting richer. The poor seem to be getting poorer. The oppressed all seem to be getting away with it. But there are moments, aren't there? For me, a few glimpses of justice in an unjust world recently are the Derek Chauvin trial and sentencing, or Jonathan Irons being freed from prison after serving 22 years for a wrongful conviction, thanks in part to the tireless work of our sister in Christ, Maya Moore. Or Harvey Weinstein going to jail for sexual assault, or at least for me, when people repeat misinformation and disinformation on social media, and then they get one of those like bright red statements that applies to their posts from there on, saying that there's misinformation in this, or I've heard of, I don't know, I haven't had this happen to any of my friends, but that sometimes people's posts are actually cause for violence and they get kicked off media. But like, that might be a glimmer of justice in an unjust world. Do you see those? Do you look for those? Or do you just look for the sea of injustice that is our world? Habakkuk, he offers this model of dealing with calamity and tough times. He actually looks away from it, and he looks up to see God. He looks back to see God's acts of salvation. But he also looks around for times when God's justice is actually being worked out in this world even right now. But stay with me. Most sermons usually have like 3 points, and this is going to be 4. So you got to stay with me. Because Habakkuk does one final thing that helps him trust God in this lose-lose scenario. He doesn't just look up, and he doesn't just look back, and he doesn't just look around. He also looks ahead with conviction that God's strength will carry him through this double calamity. As Habakkuk ends this prayer, he does something different structurally. Whereas at the beginning of each of the verses, there's been this Selah, remember that? That signals the kind of the repeating of the chorus and that a new verse is coming. Well, this time, there isn't a Selah, but instead he paraphrases the first line of the chorus. So when you see these things side by side, the first line of the chorus reads, "I have heard," and that's the verb, "all about you, Yahweh. I am filled with awe by your amazing works." But now, as he comes to the end of this song, instead of repeating the chorus word for word, he paraphrases it and uses that same verb. "I trembled inside when I heard this. My lips quivered with fear. My legs gave way beneath me, and I shook in terror. Notice I trembled when I heard. Now, with paraphrasing this, Habakkuk is probably doing this because he's going to turn away from the themes of the chorus, and he's going to do something different. The themes of the chorus are, in this time of our deep need, he's asking for help us again, and in your anger, remember your mercy. But now Habakkuk decides, instead of emphasizing that, for the fourth time it would be, Habakkuk instead wants to go a different direction. And he ends this song by looking ahead. He looks ahead to see God's strength carrying him through the coming calamities, this lose-lose scenario. He concludes his prayer with this: I will wait patiently for the coming day when disaster will strike the people who invade us. Even though, it's going to get really bad, the fig trees have no blossoms and there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields and the cattle barns are empty, even though, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the Lord of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes me as sure-footed as a deer, able to tread upon the heights. In the face of this coming calamity, Habakkuk is convinced that he will be able to wait patiently. He will be able to rejoice in the Lord. He will draw on God's sovereign strength. And he looks ahead to see God making him what? Sure-footed and treading on the heights. He looks ahead to see God carrying him through this calamity with his trust in God intact. When tough times come, would you dare to look away? Look away in order to look up and see God? Dare to look away in order to look back and see God's salvation? Dare to look away in order to look around and see God's justice at work in the world? Dare to look away in order to look ahead with conviction that God's strength is going to carry you through this. To some extent, we all live with this knowledge, don't we? That a calamity is coming at some time in our lifetime. In spite of the promise of the American dream, it's going to hit all of us. It might be through the unexpected death of a loved one. It might be through a diagnosis. It might be through being hit by a natural disaster. It might be through a job loss or a wayward child. But even it's possible it could be because of the fall of our country, like Israel experienced. When that calamity comes, what will you do? What will I do? What will we do? Well, Habakkuk models for us what it looks like to live by faith. He laments to God. He negotiates with God. And God's just fine with that. But in the end, he's able to look away and he's able to trust God. And he's able to trust God because in looking away, he has looked up and he's seen God in the beauty and in the power of creation. He's able to trust God because he's looked away in order to look back and to remember. The bread that was broken was the body of Jesus. The cup that you lifted was the blood of Jesus given for us and our salvation. He's able to trust through this calamity because he's looked away and he's looked around and he's seen little flecks, little glimpses of justice on the sea of injustice of our world. He's able to trust because he was dared to even look away in order to actually daydream, in a sense, about the future. And he daydreamed that God's strength would carry him through. He'd be able to quietly wait. He'd be able to become like a deer that's sure-footed and able to scale the heights and to overcome. Imagine if you, imagine if me, imagine if we responded to calamities and tough times like that. And we're able to trust God in that kind of way. Imagine what a witness we would be to those who do not yet know Jesus. Will you pray with me? Father, Son, and Spirit, we desire to be your people, to be those who follow in your footsteps in this world and remain faithful to you for all the days that you give us. And God, we know that tough times are coming. We know that tough times maybe have already hit for many in this room. And I just pray that you would be a God of all comfort to each person who is struggling in some kind of way today with a tough time or maybe even a full-blown calamity. And we thank you that, as we have been reminded already, that you are a God who is with us in it. That you are a God who is for us in it. You are a God who desires our best through it. And you are a God who promises to give us the strength to make it through with you and with one another in such a way that in the end, our trust in you is indeed intact. We pray that you would do that work in us, through us, around us, and even at times in spite of us.